What do you do when you come home early, hear your wife laughing about being pregnant by her boss, and realize you're the punchline? Do you explode, or do you stay quiet long enough to make her regret every word? My name is Adrian Vale, and I learned the hard way that love can be reduced to background noise when people think you are not in the room. I came home early that afternoon because my shift ended ahead of schedule, and because the city outside our building felt like it was holding its breath, cold air pressed flat against the windows and the sidewalks shining with thin ice. I had planned a small surprise, nothing heroic, just a decent meal and a quiet night, the kind that used to mean something when we still spoke like partners instead of roommates sharing a calendar. I carried a paper bag with fresh bread and a cheap bottle of wine, and I climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, because the elevator always smelled like someone's nervous cologne and stale arguments. When I reached our door, I noticed it was not fully latched, just resting against the frame as if the apartment itself had grown careless. I pushed it open slowly, not because I was suspicious, but because I did not want to slam into whatever moment was happening inside. I heard laughter first, bright and careless, the sort of laughter that belongs to people who think consequences are for someone else, and then I heard my wife's voice, sharp with pride and cruelty, the voice she used when she talked to her friends about other people's mistakes. She said it clearly, like she wanted the words to stick to the walls, that she was pregnant by her boss, and that her husband did not even suspect. Her friends laughed like a small chorus of hyenas, and someone clinked a glass against another glass, as if betrayal was a toast-worthy achievement. I stood in the hallway with the bread cooling in my hand, and my stomach did that slow, sick drop that makes you feel weightless and heavy at the same time. In that suspended second, I understood how easily a marriage can become an audience, and how quickly the lead actor forgets the supporting character is still reading the script. I could have stepped in and screamed, and I could have thrown the wine against the wall and watched it bleed down the paint like a dramatic confession. I could have become the story they would tell later, the unstable husband, the predictable man who reacts exactly as expected, and I knew they were already prepared to frame me that way. Instead, I stepped into the room as if I had only just arrived, because I had, in a way, only just arrived in the truth. The living room was warm and bright, with the overhead light turned on too early for the time of day, and my wife, Liana, was perched on the couch with a smug tilt to her chin, her phone in one hand, her glass in the other. 3 of her friends were there, arranged like witnesses who thought they were safe because they had numbers, and their faces changed when they saw me, surprise snapping into place before fear could fully catch up. My wife's smile did not die immediately, because she still believed in her own control, and that delay told me more than any confession could. I set the bag down on the table without shaking, because if your hands stay calm, your mind can stay sharp, and sharpness was all I had left. I looked at them one by one, not with rage, but with the kind of quiet attention that makes people feel exposed, because attention is a spotlight when you do not want to be seen. My wife's friends suddenly found the carpet fascinating, as if the fibers might offer them an escape route. Liana's eyes flicked toward the hallway, calculating distance, exits, options, and she tried to recover her posture like a performer who missed a line. I asked, with a flat voice that did not rise, what exactly was so funny that it needed a full audience in my home. One friend mumbled something about a joke, another one picked at her sleeve, and the third one tried to laugh again, but it came out thin and desperate, like a cigarette dragged too hard. Liana attempted to talk over them, and she said it was just girl talk, harmless venting, nothing serious, and she looked at me as if her confidence could rewrite the last 30 seconds. I did not argue with her version of reality, because arguing only gives a liar more practice. I simply nodded, and I asked her, in the same calm tone, if she wanted to repeat what she had said, slowly, with me in the room this time. Silence fell, thick and immediate, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic below. Liana's face tightened at the corners, and she lifted her chin again as if pride could substitute for innocence. She claimed she never said those words, and she said her friends were exaggerating, and she said I had misunderstood. The room filled with the kind of discomfort that always shows up when someone lies badly, because even liars hate being forced to watch another liar fail. I looked at her friends again, and one of them, a woman named Kira, who had always enjoyed being cruel on behalf of other people, opened her mouth as if to rescue Liana, then closed it when she realized she might drown with her. Liana tried to pull the conversation into a fight, because a fight is chaos, and chaos is cover. She asked why I was home early, why I was snooping, why I was barging in, and she tried to turn the door being open into my fault, as if the universe had conspired against her, and I was merely the instrument. I let her talk, and I watched her, because the first rule of catching a lie is letting it run long enough to trip over itself. I said I was home because I live here, because I pay for the lock on the door, and because I had once believed this was a place that belonged to both of us, not just a stage for her private jokes. I did not ask her to explain the pregnancy claim in detail, because I already knew what she would do, which was to twist and pivot until the truth became a fog. Instead, I asked a smaller question, a controlled question, the kind that corners a person without them realizing the walls are moving. I asked who her boss was, because I had heard her mention his name before in passing, always casually, always with that extra brightness in her tone that I had ignored because trust makes you stupid. Liana blinked once, and she said his name was Ryan, too quickly, as if she was tired of pretending. The air shifted, and her friends exchanged glances that confirmed more than they intended. I said nothing for a moment, and that pause turned into pressure, because people fear silence more than shouting, since silence forces them to fill it with their own guilt. Liana tried to laugh again, and she said Ryan was just a boss, a harmless flirt, a man who liked attention, and she called it office nonsense, nothing more. I asked if office nonsense usually ends in pregnancy, and she snapped that I was being dramatic, and then she moved to stand up, and the movement was not bold, it was evasive. I stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her like a brute, just placing my body in the path of the simplest exit, the way a bouncer does when the music stops. Her friends began gathering their things, muttering excuses about errands and dinner and timing, and I told them they could leave, because they were not the point, they were just the audience. Kira hesitated, looking at Liana like she wanted permission, and Liana gave a tiny nod that said, "Get out. Save yourself." The door closed behind them, and suddenly the apartment felt too large, like the walls had pulled back to reveal how much emptiness we had been ignoring. Liana tried a new angle, softer now, and she said I was taking a joke too seriously, and she blamed stress, and she mentioned how hard work had been, and she tried to fold the lie into a story about pressure and loneliness. She wanted sympathy, because sympathy is another kind of cover. I listened without reacting, and I noticed how she never once said she was not pregnant, only that I was overreacting to what I heard. That detail mattered, because liars rarely deny what they cannot deny, and instead they attack your right to ask. I asked her, again calmly, whether she was pregnant, and she rolled her eyes as if I was asking about the weather. She said it was possible, and then she said she had not confirmed, and then she said it was none of my business until she decided it was real, and that contradiction was like a fingerprint on glass. I told her that if there was a child, it was my business, because I would not be cast as the fool raising someone else's secret with a smile. Her eyes hardened, and she accused me of being controlling, and she accused me of being paranoid, and she said I never understood her ambitions, which was rich coming from a woman who had just turned her ambition into a punchline. I asked her what her ambition was, exactly, because from where I stood, it looked like she wanted to climb by stepping on people who loved her. She slapped the back of the couch with her palm, not hard, just enough to make a sound, because she wanted noise. She said I had been distant, that I had been boring, that I had stopped making her feel chosen, and she spoke in the language of justification, the kind people use when they want to feel like villains only because the world forced them. I did not defend my performance as a husband, because the moment you defend, you accept the premise that betrayal is a debate. I told her the truth in plain words, that she was responsible for her choices, and that her excuses did not change the fact that she had laughed about humiliating me in my own home. She stared at me, then looked away, and in that movement, I saw something I had not seen in months. Fear, not fear of losing me, but fear of losing control of the narrative. She asked what I was going to do, and the question was less about emotion and more about strategy. I told her I was going to learn what was real, and I said it as if I was talking about a bill that needed reconciling, because that was what it had become. She scoffed, and she said good luck, because Ryan would never leave his position, and nobody would believe me anyway, and her confidence was too specific to be empty. I asked her whether she had told Ryan she was pregnant, and she paused for a fraction of a second, then said no, and the pause was an answer. I nodded once, and I picked up the paper bag again, and I carried it to the kitchen like I was still planning dinner. The normal movement made her uneasy, because she wanted drama, and I gave her routine, which is harder to fight. That night, the apartment felt like a crime scene that no one had taped off yet. Liana slept in the bedroom, and I slept on the couch, not because I was being noble, but because I needed distance from her breathing. I stared at the ceiling for hours, watching the shadows from passing cars move like slow hands over the plaster. My mind kept returning to the laughter, to the casual way she had said it, to the fact that it was not whispered, it was announced. I realized then that the betrayal was not only the potential child, not only the boss, not only the secret, but the contempt. Contempt is what kills a marriage long before anyone signs paperwork. Near dawn, when the city began to lighten, I made a decision that felt cold but clean. I would not confront Ryan in a parking lot or send angry messages that could be screenshot and shared as proof of my instability. I would not beg Liana for honesty, because begging turns you into a prop. I would do what I always did when something mattered, which was to gather facts, organize them, and let the truth do the damage without my voice shaking. In the morning, I watched Liana get ready for work with a careful calm, like a man observing a stranger in his own home. She moved with that practiced efficiency that had once impressed me, and she avoided looking at the couch until the moment she had to pass it. When she finally looked at me, her expression was defensive, as if she expected me to start the war at breakfast. I asked one simple question, whether Ryan was her direct boss or a senior boss, and she asked why it mattered. I told her it mattered because lies have shapes, and I was mapping hers. She snapped that he was her department head, and she grabbed her keys, and she told me to stop obsessing. I nodded again, and I said I would stop obsessing when she stopped lying. That hit her, because she flinched, and then she left quickly, heels clicking like a countdown. When the door closed, I sat at the kitchen table and opened a notebook I had not used in years, and I wrote the date and time at the top of the page, because memory lies, but ink stays loyal. By noon, I had a list of questions that did not look emotional on paper, and that was the point, because emotion makes you sloppy, and sloppy makes you lose. I did not need to become a detective with gadgets, because my life was already full of ordinary evidence, the kind people ignore because it looks too boring to matter. Liana and I shared a few accounts, not because we were romantic, but because adulthood requires utilities, rent, groceries, and small expenses that pile up like dust. If she was meeting Ryan, if she was building a secret life, it would leave traces in places she assumed I never checked, because she had always thought I was too trusting to be thorough. I opened the banking app on my phone and scrolled through transactions, and I did not look for a smoking gun, because smoking guns are rare outside movies. I looked for patterns, for repeated charges at odd times, for rideshare fees in neighborhoods we did not visit together, for restaurant tabs on nights she claimed she was working late. It was not difficult to find the first thread, and that fact alone made my chest feel hollow. There were several rideshare charges over the last month, always on weekdays, always between 9 and 11 at night, always just far enough from her office to be inconvenient if she were truly working late. There were also small charges at a hotel lounge bar downtown, the kind of place people choose when they want privacy, but still want to feel important. I took screenshots, not because I needed to feel powerful, but because I needed a record that could survive gaslighting. I labeled them in a folder on my phone with dates, and I wrote those same dates in my notebook because redundancy is safety. I did not call anyone, and I did not text Liana because I refused to give her a warning. If she knew I was watching, she would change tactics, and I needed her to stay comfortable enough to make mistakes. Comfort is the enemy of secrecy. That evening, Liana came home at a normal hour, which was almost funny in a cruel way, as if she believed normalcy could erase yesterday's confession. She greeted me with a brightness that did not reach her eyes, and she offered a simple peace treaty: dinner, small talk, a shallow apology without admitting anything. She wanted to reset, to drag me back into the old pattern where I would accept half-truths because I feared conflict. I played my part with minimal words, not because I forgave her, but because calm makes people careless. She talked about work, about a new project, about deadlines, about how her boss was demanding, and she watched my face when she said the word boss, measuring whether it landed. I gave her nothing, and she did not like that, because she wanted either anger or relief. When I asked casually whether Ryan had attended the team meeting she mentioned, she said yes too quickly, then corrected herself and said he had joined by phone. That small correction was a gift, because it meant she was building her lies while talking, not telling the truth from memory. After dinner, she went to shower, and her phone buzzed on the counter while the water ran. I did not pick it up, and I did not unlock it, because I did not need illegal access or cheap tricks. The screen lit up with a lockscreen preview, a simple message notification with a name at the top. The name was Ryan, and the preview line was short, but it was enough to bruise the air in my lungs. It mentioned the same lounge bar I had seen in the transactions, and it asked if she was still coming tonight. I took a photo of the phone screen with my own phone, because photographs are honest about time, and then I wrote the exact minute in my notebook. When Liana stepped out of the bathroom, her hair damp and her shoulders relaxed, she saw me sitting at the table with my hands folded, and she paused like an animal sensing a trap. I asked her, with an almost bored tone, whether she was going anywhere tonight, and she said no, she was exhausted. I nodded, and I said good, because I needed her here, and I watched the lie pass over her face like a thin shadow. An hour later, she claimed she had forgotten she promised her friends a quick drink, and she said it was just a short stop, and she would be back soon. She tried to make it seem harmless, like a normal social obligation, and she even mentioned Kira's name because she thought that would soften it. I told her I did not care, and I meant it in the coldest way, because caring was no longer my job. She bristled, and she asked what that was supposed to mean, and I said it meant she should go live whatever story she was writing, because I was done editing it for her. She left with a sharp slam of the door, more offended by my indifference than she ever was by my pain. I sat in the silence and listened to my own breathing, then I opened my notebook and wrote, "She lied again after Ryan's message," and the sentence looked clinical, like a note in a file. Over the next week, I became a quiet accountant of betrayal, and I did it without turning into a caricature. I did not follow her, and I did not sit in a car outside her office, because that would make me the suspicious husband in her story. Instead, I tracked what came to me naturally, what a shared life already revealed without effort. A receipt in the kitchen trash for a pharmacy pregnancy test she claimed she never bought, with a timestamp that matched a night she said she worked late. A shared calendar entry she had created for a team-building dinner, which disappeared the next day, leaving an empty gap that still showed in the calendar's edit history on my synced device. A cloud photo memory on our shared album, an automatic 1 year ago today reminder from a restaurant interior, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a man's hand with a distinctive signet ring resting near her glass. The ring was not mine, and the hand placement was intimate enough to be unmistakable. I saved the screen, and I wrote the date, and I felt my heart shift from shock into something colder, something that could function. Liana, meanwhile, started applying pressure in her own way, because she could sense that I was no longer participating in her denial. She accused me of withdrawing, of punishing her, of acting superior. She started telling her family small, careful stories, the kind that sound reasonable when you only hear one side. I noticed the change when her sister called me and asked, in a forced, casual tone, whether everything was okay at home, because Liana seemed stressed. I answered politely, and I said we were working through some issues, and I did not give details, because I did not want to be the man gossiping about his own humiliation. But I wrote it down afterward because it meant she was laying groundwork, building a social safety net in case she needed to fall. That told me Ryan was not just an affair. He was part of an exit strategy. The real shift came on a Friday night when I attended a charity fundraiser at a hotel ballroom, the kind of event my workplace supported because it looked good in photos, and the kind of event Liana loved because she could dress up and feel admired. She had insisted we go together weeks ago, back when she still pretended we were fine, and she acted excited about it as if enthusiasm could glue cracks shut. We arrived separately because she claimed she had to stop at the office first to pick up documents, and she told me to meet her there. That alone was suspicious, but I let it happen because I wanted to see what she did when she thought she had freedom. The ballroom was crowded with polite smiles and overpriced drinks, and I moved through it like a man who had forgotten how to relax. I greeted colleagues, shook hands, and watched the doors, not like a jealous animal, but like a man waiting for a pattern to reveal itself. When Liana finally arrived, she did not come alone. She came with Ryan, not arm in arm, not openly, but close enough to share space as if it belonged to them. He was taller than I expected, with the easy confidence of a man who believes rules bend for him, and he wore that same signet ring I had seen in the photo corner. Liana introduced him to people like he was simply from work, and she introduced me like I was an accessory, her husband, as if the word should neutralize any suspicion. Ryan shook my hand with a firm grip and a pleasant smile, and his eyes held mine for a fraction too long, as if he was testing whether I knew. I returned his smile with the same calm, and I let him believe I was harmless, because underestimation is the only advantage a betrayed man gets for free. During the speeches, Liana kept disappearing to greet people, and Ryan kept drifting in the same direction, and it was almost insulting how little effort they made to hide it in that room full of distractions. I watched them from a distance, the way you watch a con artist work a crowd, and I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. A woman I recognized from Liana's workplace, an office administrator type who knew everyone's schedules, approached Ryan with a tight expression and whispered something into his ear. Ryan's face changed, not into fear, but into irritation, as if someone had brought him an inconvenient reminder of the real world. Liana's eyes darted toward me then, quick and sharp, and she pulled Ryan away toward a side corridor near the coat check. That corridor was lined with mirrors, and their reflections multiplied as they moved, like a warning. I did not chase them, because chasing would confirm the role she wanted me to play. Instead, I walked calmly toward the coat check area, not rushing, not glaring, just moving as if I needed fresh air. A coat check attendant, bored and half asleep, handed a ticket to a man ahead of me, and I saw Liana's hand appear from the side corridor, reaching toward the attendant. The attendant passed her a small envelope, the kind of envelope used for VIP access or special instructions, and Liana tucked it into her clutch quickly. She looked up and saw me. For 1 second her face went blank, and in that blankness I saw guilt, calculation, and panic fighting for control. Then she smiled too hard, and she said she was just checking something for Ryan, and she asked why I was hovering. I told her I was not hovering. I was collecting my own coat check ticket because I did not trust crowded rooms. The attendant, without meaning to, said aloud that Liana had already checked in earlier and that her ticket had been waiting. Liana's mouth opened slightly, then closed, and the moment snapped into place like a trap finally catching. I nodded politely, thanked the attendant, and stepped away, leaving Liana standing there with her smile cracking at the edges. I returned to the ballroom and sat down, and I let the noise wash over me because the real damage was not done in loud scenes, it was done in records and witnesses and timing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I checked it, I saw a merchant alert on my account for a lounge bar charge, the same lounge bar again, time-stamped 10 minutes earlier. I looked up across the room and saw Ryan's empty chair near the sponsor table, and I understood that while I was being paraded as the husband, my money was being used to fund the private story they were writing behind my back. I saved the alert, and I wrote the time in my notebook, and I felt something settle inside me with finality. Liana returned to our table later with a forced laugh and a glass of champagne she did not need, and she leaned close and asked what my problem was, because she could sense the shift but could not name it. I told her I had no problem, and that was the truth, because problems can be solved, and she was no longer a problem, she was a choice I was preparing to end. She stared at me, searching for anger, for tears, for something she could use, and she found nothing. The speech ended, applause rose, and the crowd stood to mingle again, and Liana's hand slid onto my arm like a claim. I did not pull away, because pulling away would make a scene, and scenes are messy. I simply stood, smiled at the nearest couple, and walked toward the exit with Liana still attached to me, like a woman clinging to a sinking ship without realizing the water had already reached her ankles. Outside the ballroom, in the quiet hallway under the hotel's cold lighting, Liana finally dropped the act. She hissed that I was humiliating her by being weird, and she said I needed to stop acting like a stranger. I looked at her and asked, calmly, whether she was pregnant, and her eyes flashed with anger that was too quick for innocence. She said I was obsessed, and she told me Ryan was important to her career, and she said I should not ruin things out of jealousy. I nodded slowly and said I was not jealous, I was documenting. The word hit her like a slap, because documentation is the opposite of drama, and drama is what she knew how to control. She opened her mouth to argue again, but before she could, Ryan appeared at the hallway corner, adjusting his cuff, face composed, as if he had just stepped out of a private meeting. He saw us, paused, and then walked toward us with that same pleasant smile, the one he wore like a badge. He asked if everything was okay, pretending concern, and Liana's posture shifted instantly, softening into a version of herself meant for him. I looked at Ryan, then at Liana, and I asked Ryan one simple question, still calm, still quiet, whether he enjoyed using my account for his drinks. Liana's eyes widened, and Ryan's smile froze in place for a fraction of a second before he recovered. He said he had no idea what I meant, and he laughed lightly, because powerful people laugh when they want to make you look unstable. I held my phone up, screen turned toward him, showing the alert with the bar name and time, and I said I knew exactly what I meant. Ryan's gaze flicked to Liana, and in that flick, I saw something I had been waiting for. Not love, not romance, but risk assessment. Liana grabbed my wrist hard enough to sting, and she whispered that we would talk at home, and her voice had that desperate edge that only appears when the mask is slipping. Ryan stepped back slightly, still composed, but the confidence in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by annoyance and caution. He said we should not discuss personal matters here, and he suggested we all calm down, and the words sounded like a command wrapped in politeness. I smiled at him, small and controlled, and I said I was very calm, and that was why he should be careful. Then I turned to Liana, and I told her we would go home, because I needed to sleep, and because tomorrow I would start making phone calls that did not involve shouting, only paperwork. Her grip tightened, and for the first time since I overheard her laugh, I saw real fear cross her face. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the life she had been building in secret. We walked out of the hotel together, the three of us separated by inches that felt like miles, and the cold air outside hit my face like a clean slap. Liana tried to speak in the car, but I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth closed, because silence is a warning when it comes from someone who used to argue. She watched me the entire ride, and I felt her breathing change with each streetlight, as if she was counting how many seconds she had left before I did whatever she imagined I was about to do. When we pulled into our building's lot, she asked, almost pleading, what I wanted. I parked, turned off the engine, and looked at her with a calm that made even me feel unfamiliar. I told her I wanted the truth, in writing, with dates, and I wanted it before she had time to rewrite it. She swallowed hard and asked what would happen if she refused. I leaned slightly closer and said that if she refused, I would stop being her husband and start being her evidence. Then I opened the car door and stepped out into the night, leaving her sitting there in the dark, and I could feel the next move coming like thunder behind a sealed window. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray light that makes every object look guilty, as if the sun itself does not want to testify. Liana moved through the apartment like she was trying not to touch anything, because touching things makes them real, and real things leave fingerprints. She acted tired, then offended, then fragile, cycling masks like outfits, hoping one of them would make me soften, but I had already crossed that internal line where softness becomes self-harm. I made coffee, not as a gesture of peace, but as a ritual of control, and I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook open, letting the page stare back at me like an empty witness statement. Liana hovered near the counter, arms folded, eyes sharp, and she finally asked if I was going to keep punishing her with silence. I told her I was not punishing her, because punishment implies authority, and what I was doing was observing, because observation is what you do when trust has died, but facts still matter. She rolled her eyes and muttered that I was acting like some kind of investigator, as if that was ridiculous, as if the truth should be treated like a small inconvenience. I looked up slowly and said I was acting like a husband who heard his wife laugh about being pregnant by her boss, and then watched her prove it with a string of lies that kept snapping louder than her excuses. She tried to pivot, because pivoting is what people do when they cannot deny, and she said the pregnancy line was exaggerated, that it was a shock joke, a dramatic way to vent, and her friends were the kind of women who laughed at anything cruel. That line might have worked on someone still clinging to hope, but hope had already been replaced by a colder substance, something like clarity, and clarity does not negotiate with half-truths. I asked her a simple question, again, because simple questions are the ones liars fear most, and I asked whether she had taken a test. Liana's mouth tightened, and she said she had. Then she said it was inconclusive. Then she said she did not owe me medical details, and she looked away as if privacy could erase paternity. I nodded and wrote down, in full view of her, she admits a test exists. And the act of writing made her flinch harder than any insult. She demanded to know what I was writing, and I told her I was building a timeline, because the timeline does not care how charming she thinks she is. Liana stepped closer and tried to snatch the notebook, and I moved it away without drama, the way you move a glass away from someone who is already unsteady. The motion made her angrier, because it confirmed I was not playing the same emotional game anymore, and she snapped that I was treating her like a criminal. I said I was treating her like a person who had created criminal levels of deceit, even if the consequences would remain civil, professional, and social. She laughed once, sharp and defensive, and told me I would never win against Ryan because Ryan had power, connections, and a reputation, and people like me were disposable. She said it like a fact she had accepted long ago, and I felt something in my chest go still, because it meant she had already chosen sides before I ever knew there was a war. I stood and walked to the window, watching the street below, letting the quiet stretch long enough to pull truth out of her impatience. I asked her, without raising my voice, whether Ryan knew she told her friends she was pregnant by him. She hesitated, and then she said no, and the lie was too quick, too polished, too eager, and I understood she had practiced it. I turned back and said, calmly, that she would text him right now and tell him, because if it was a joke, it would not hurt to clarify, and if it was real, she would rather swallow glass than risk his reaction. Liana's face shifted from anger to panic in a way she could not fully hide, and she said I was being controlling again, that I had no right to force her into humiliating conversations. I told her she had forced humiliation into my life without my consent, and now she would learn what it felt like when the spotlight did not belong to her. She stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door, and the slam was meant to be a punctuation mark, but to me it sounded like a weak period at the end of a lie. I sat back down and opened my phone, not to spy, not to hack, not to commit some stupid act that would poison my own case, but to organize what was already mine to see. I created a folder labeled with the month and copied screenshots into it. Rideshare receipts on my account, merchant alerts, the lockscreen preview photo, the shared cloud memory frame with the signet ring, and the calendar gap that showed an event had existed and then been quietly erased. Each item was small, boring even, the kind of evidence people dismiss because it lacks cinematic flair, but together they formed a pattern, and patterns are what institutions actually respond to when they are forced to. By late afternoon, I called a family lawyer, not because I was eager to burn the marriage down, but because I needed to know how the fire would spread if I lit it. I did not ask for revenge fantasies or dramatic courtroom scenes, and I did not mention Ryan's name at first because I wanted to hear the process without the distraction of outrage. The lawyer, a measured woman named Elise Hart, listened while I described the basics, and when I said the word pregnant, her tone changed, not into sympathy, but into precision. She asked whether there were children already, and I said no, and the absence of children felt like a strange mercy because it meant fewer innocent pieces on the board. She asked what I wanted, and I said I wanted the truth documented, and I wanted a clean separation if the truth was as ugly as it seemed. Elise told me, in careful terms, that if there was a pregnancy and paternity was in question, it would become a central issue, and she advised me not to confront Ryan directly in a way that could be framed as harassment. Her advice matched my instincts, and it confirmed that my calm was not cowardice, it was strategy. When I hung up, Liana emerged from the bedroom with red eyes that looked practiced rather than exhausted, and she asked who I had called. I told her I called a lawyer, and the words hit the room like a dropped plate. She immediately tried to turn herself into the victim, saying I was threatening her, that I was trying to scare her into submission, and she accused me of wanting to ruin her life over a misunderstanding. I said I did not want to ruin her life, because she had been doing that on her own, and I was simply removing myself as her shield. She demanded to know what I would tell people, and that question revealed her real fear, because she was less concerned with my pain than with her reputation. I told her I would tell people the truth only when the truth had paper behind it, because I was not interested in gossip, I was interested in consequences that hold. That night, she did not go out, and that was not loyalty, it was damage control. She stayed in the apartment, pacing, watching me as if I might lunge, but I did not even look up when she passed. I kept building the ledger, and I realized something that made the situation even uglier. Liana was not just cheating, she was spending as if the marriage was already a resource to strip. The hotel lounge charges were not small, and there were several boutique store transactions that did not match her usual habits. Purchases made near her office on lunch breaks she claimed she never took. The pattern suggested someone was feeding her a new self-image, and people like Ryan love that, because building someone's vanity is the fastest way to buy their silence. I printed the statement lines at a local kiosk the next morning, using only my own account access, and I stapled them in order, because truth looks more serious when it is organized. A week later, the pressure shifted again, because Liana's workplace began leaking into our home like smoke. She started coming home later, not with excuses, but with a new kind of confidence, and that confidence smelled like someone had promised her a future that did not include me. She mentioned upcoming leadership meetings, private reviews, special projects, all vague enough to be believable, but consistent enough to be scripted. I noticed she began repeating certain phrases word for word, as if she had been coached on what to say when questioned, and I wrote those phrases down, because repeated language is a tell, and coached language is evidence of intent. One evening, she walked in with a glossy folder under her arm and set it on the table too quickly, as if she wanted me to see it but not touch it. When she went to shower, the folder remained there, and its label was half visible, the kind of label that looks harmless until you understand context. It contained material for a charity gala committee, and the committee's name matched the fundraiser hotel ballroom we had attended. That detail mattered, because it meant Ryan's world and Liana's world were mixing in public institutions, places where policy and optics can cut deeper than any private argument. Charity organizations are allergic to scandal, not because they are moral, but because donors are, and donors love clean stories. I started searching public pages, not hacking, not stalking, just looking at open information the way anyone could. The charity had a public guest list page for sponsors, and Ryan's name appeared under corporate patron. Liana's name appeared under committee member. There was also a note about an upcoming board-adjacent dinner, smaller, more private, invitation only, hosted by a board chair known for strict professionalism. I stared at that page and felt my mind lock onto a new path, because if Liana and Ryan were brazen enough to overlap there, it gave me an arena with rules, minutes, and witnesses. Still, I needed more than suspicion and screenshots, because public exposure without an institutional trigger is just noise, and noise can be dismissed. The institutional trigger had to be something official, a policy breach, a conflict of interest, a misuse of company resources, something that forces action without turning me into a vengeful husband ranting into the void. I looked again at the rideshare receipts, and I noticed the pickup locations were not random. Several started near Ryan's office building, and several ended near the same boutique hotel. If Ryan was her boss, then using my account for rideshares and lounge bars was not just personal cruelty, it was a pattern of concealment that could violate workplace policy, especially if there were expense reimbursements involved. I did not have to prove their intimacy directly, because policies often punish the behavior around the affair, the lies, the misrepresentations, the misuse of resources, the conflict of interest in managing an employee you are involved with. On a Thursday night, Liana announced she had a board prep dinner tied to the charity, and she dressed with unusual care, selecting jewelry she rarely wore, and she chose perfume she knew I liked, which felt like a small act of sadistic theater. She said she would be home late, and she said it like a challenge. I nodded, smiled faintly, and told her to enjoy herself. That response made her pause, because she wanted resistance, and when resistance did not come, she looked almost unsettled. She left, and within 20 minutes, my phone buzzed with another merchant alert, the same lounge bar, the same pattern, and I saved it with a date stamp and wrote it down. Then I did something simple, lawful, and quietly devastating. I called the lounge bar using the number on the statement and asked, politely, whether they could confirm whether a tab billed to my card at that time was paid in person or pre-authorized earlier. The manager, cautious but not suspicious, said he could not provide customer details, but he could confirm a tab was opened and closed within a certain window, and he gave me the window without names. That window matched Liana's claimed dinner start time, meaning her alibi was already bleeding. When she returned after midnight, she tried to move like a ghost, keys quiet, shoes in hand, as if stealth could rewrite timestamps. I was awake on the couch, not because I was waiting with jealousy, but because I wanted to see her face when she realized I was not sleeping through my own erasure. She froze when she saw me, and she asked why I was still awake, voice sharpened with annoyance that did not belong to a guilty person pretending innocence. I asked her how the board prep dinner went, and she launched into details too quickly, describing people, appetizers, conversations, the kind of lie that comes with unnecessary decoration. I nodded through it, and when she finished, I asked one question, small and surgical. I asked whether the dinner had been at the hotel lounge bar downtown. She blinked, and she said no. It was at a different place, and she named a restaurant across town. I leaned forward and held up my phone, showing the merchant alert time, and I did not accuse her. I simply let the evidence sit between us like a weapon I did not have to swing. Her face drained of color in stages, like someone watching their own reflection crack. She tried to say the charge must be fraud, a mistake, a glitch, and she reached for her own phone as if she could summon a better explanation. I asked her calmly whether she wanted to call the bank right now and report fraud, because fraud reports require commitment, and liars hate commitment. She hesitated, and that hesitation was the confession, even if she never said it aloud. She snapped that she did not have time for my paranoia, and she said she was going to bed. I told her she could go, but I also told her that tomorrow I would request a full statement printout and attach it to a civil filing if necessary, because I was done financing secrets. Liana's eyes flashed with something ugly. Then she walked away without answering, and the silence she left behind felt louder than any fight we had ever had. I sat there after she disappeared into the bedroom, staring at the dark television screen, seeing my own face reflected back with a calm I barely recognized. I realized I was no longer chasing proof of sex or romance, because that proof was not required for the outcome I wanted. I was building a record of deception, misuse, and conflict, a record that could be read by a lawyer, by a committee chair, by HR, by anyone whose job required them to protect an institution's optics. The irony was sharp enough to taste. Liana had laughed because she believed I did not suspect, but suspicion was never my strength. Documentation was. I closed the notebook and placed it in a clear sleeve with a date label, and for the first time since the day I overheard her, I slept for a few hours without dreaming, because my mind had finally chosen a direction. The following Monday, I received a message from Liana that did not sound like her, which meant it probably did not belong to her alone. She asked if we could talk calmly after work, and she said she wanted to resolve things like adults, and she added a line about how stress had made her say stupid things. The phrasing was too neat, too therapeutic, the kind of language people borrow when they want to sound reasonable without being honest. I replied with one sentence that I would talk when she provided a written timeline of her last 30 days, including where she was, who she was with, and what expenses she placed on shared resources. The message sat as seen for hours, and I could almost picture her staring at it, realizing I was not asking for apologies. I was asking for structure. That night, she came home early, and she brought a small paper bag of pastries like a peace offering, and she set it on the table as if sugar could cover rot. She began with tears, because tears are a tool, and she was good with tools. She said she felt trapped. She said Ryan had pressured her. She said she never meant for it to go this far, and she said the pregnancy line was a panic joke that got out of hand. I listened without interrupting, because even a liar tells pieces of truth when they are trying to save themselves. When she claimed Ryan had pressured her, I watched her closely, and I noticed she kept framing herself as the passive one, the victim of a powerful man, which would be a convenient story if she planned to burn him later. I asked her if she was trying to set up a narrative where she was coerced, because that would protect her reputation while sacrificing Ryan, and her eyes widened with fury. She accused me of being cruel, of twisting her pain into strategy, and she said I was heartless. I told her my heart had been the only thing keeping her safe, and she had treated it like a joke for an audience. Then she said something that shifted the entire room. She said Ryan was not just her boss. He was about to become her sponsor within the company, a mentor figure who could push her into a better role, and she admitted she had been willing to play along to secure that advantage. The confession spilled out like an accident, and she realized too late how it sounded. I did not raise my voice, and I did not smile, but inside me, something clicked into place, because now I had a motive beyond romance. It was professional leverage. It was career manipulation. It was a power dynamic that HR and policy committees actually care about, not because they care about marriages, but because they care about liability. I asked her whether she had received any benefits, gifts, reimbursements, or opportunities tied to this relationship, and she hesitated again, and that hesitation told me the answer was yes. She tried to switch back to emotion, insisting she still loved me, insisting she did not want a divorce, insisting we could fix it, but the words fell flat because the arithmetic did not match. You cannot love someone and laugh about making them the fool, at least not in any way that deserves saving. I asked her again, calmly, whether she was pregnant, and she finally said yes, her voice small, like she wanted the confession to sound helpless. I asked whether the baby was mine, and she said she did not know, and her eyes darted away. The room felt colder, and the pastries on the table looked ridiculous, like a party favor at a funeral. I told her she would arrange a paternity test as soon as it was medically appropriate, and she said I could not force her. I told her I would not force her, because forcing creates resistance, and resistance creates delay, and delay is what liars live on. Instead, I would proceed with separation filings, and I would do it with the evidence I already had, and she could decide whether she wanted to cooperate or be exposed by the record. That was when she changed tactics again, fast and sharp, because she saw she was losing. She accused me of planning revenge, and she said I was obsessed with humiliating her, and she insisted I wanted to destroy her career. I told her she was projecting, because she was the one who had turned humiliation into entertainment. I said I did not need to destroy her career, because her career was tied to a man whose power depended on looking clean, and I had the kind of documents that make clean men nervous. Liana's breathing sped up, and she asked what documents, and I told her I had proof of repeated misuse of my account for their private meetups, proof of conflicting calendar entries, proof of a lockscreen message from Ryan that placed her at the lounge on a night she lied about. I did not show her everything, because showing everything teaches the enemy what to avoid, and I was not interested in educating her. I showed her one screenshot, one merchant alert, one timestamp, and she stared at it as if it were a verdict. She asked, in a strained voice, whether I was going to send those to her workplace, and I said I would not need to send anything if the right room asked for it, because institutions move when evidence lands in official hands. Her eyes narrowed, and she asked what room. I told her the charity committee chair was known for strict conduct, and that a conflict of interest between a sponsor and a committee member, especially one involving deception and possible misuse of funds, could trigger a review. Liana went pale, and she whispered that I would not dare, because she knew how quickly charity boards panic when scandal threatens donor trust. I told her I did not want scandal. I wanted accountability, and accountability is what happens when private sins collide with public minutes. The next day, I requested a meeting with the charity's board secretary, not to accuse, but to ask procedural questions. I framed it as a concern about donor optics, because I had attended as part of my company's involvement, and I did not mention Liana's pregnancy or our marriage, because that would make it personal gossip. I simply asked what the process was for reporting a potential conflict of interest, and the secretary explained politely that concerns could be submitted with documentation, that the chair would decide whether to investigate, and that the committee member would be asked to disclose relevant relationships. I thanked her and left with a calm I could feel in my bones. It was astonishing how easy it was to find a formal channel when you stopped trying to win emotionally and started speaking the language of institutions. That evening, Liana called me repeatedly, and when I did not answer, she texted that Ryan wanted to meet me. The line was almost comical, as if a man who had been hiding in shadows now wanted a friendly handshake in daylight. I waited an hour before replying, and I wrote simply that any communication could go through lawyers. Liana called again, and when I finally answered, her voice was trembling with anger and fear, a mixture that sounds like glass grinding. She said I was making her life impossible, and she demanded I stop, and she said Ryan could make things very hard for me if I kept pushing. I asked her what that meant, and she said Ryan could ruin reputations, he could pull strings, he could make people believe stories. The threat was clumsy, but it revealed something important. They were already discussing narrative warfare, already imagining how to paint me as unstable, controlling, abusive, anything that would discredit my evidence. I ended the call and wrote down, "Threat of reputation attack," because threats belong in records, not in arguments. Then I did something else calm and unromantic. I scheduled a consultation with a therapist, not to fix myself, but to create a boundary, a stable witness to my own behavior, someone who could later confirm I had been seeking support rather than escalating. I did not ask the therapist to keep notes for court, and I did not treat it like a weapon, but I knew that perception matters, and Liana's greatest skill was perception management. If she tried to claim I was spiraling, I wanted a counterweight that was real, not defensive. 2 days later, the midweek pressure hit like a sudden storm. Liana's sister showed up at our apartment unannounced, face tight, voice already loaded, and she accused me of emotionally abusing Liana, of trying to trap her, of threatening to destroy her career. Liana had clearly been feeding her a curated version of events, the version where I was the villain and she was the overwhelmed woman trying to survive. I did not argue with her sister, because arguing with family members is like wrestling in mud, and mud makes everyone look dirty. I simply said that Liana had told her friends she was pregnant by her boss and laughed about me not suspecting, and that I had heard it with my own ears. Liana's sister froze, the accusation collapsing into stunned silence, and she whispered, almost automatically, that Liana would never say something like that. I nodded and said I had once believed that too. Liana's sister demanded proof, and I told her I was not running a slideshow in my living room, but if Liana wanted to clear her name, she could provide a written timeline and a paternity plan. Liana's sister looked around the apartment as if searching for the missing version of Liana she used to trust, and when she did not find it, she left without another word. As the door closed, I understood that the social scaffolding around Liana was beginning to wobble, not because I was screaming, but because truth is heavy, and people feel its weight even when it is not fully spoken. That weekend, the charity committee held a small planning meeting at a community center, a pre-event session before the invitation-only dinner. Liana insisted she had to attend, and she tried to leave early, acting brisk, acting professional, but her hands shook when she reached for her keys. I told her I hoped the meeting went well, and I said it with a polite tone that scared her more than anger. She asked why I was being so calm, and I answered honestly that calm was the only way to keep the truth clean. She left, and within an hour I received an email from the charity's mailing list, an agenda preview sent to all committee members and sponsor representatives, and my name was included because of my company's role. The email contained the location, the time, and the list of attendees. Ryan's name was on it, listed under sponsor liaison. Liana's name was on it, listed under committee. I stared at the screen and felt the shape of the coming confrontation, because now the overlap was not rumor, it was official scheduling. That night, Liana returned later than the meeting should have lasted, and she claimed there had been a last-minute private discussion with Ryan about logistics. She said it casually, like it was normal, and then she realized what she had said, because her eyes flicked up to check whether it landed. I asked her if she wanted to put that in writing, because private discussions with your boss sponsor are exactly the kind of thing disclosure policies exist for. Liana snapped that I was insane, and she said I was twisting innocent conversations into scandal, and she pushed past me toward the bedroom. But as she walked away, her phone buzzed on the counter, and the lock screen lit up again, and there it was, another message from Ryan, short and careless, asking if she could keep the story straight because people were starting to notice patterns. I photographed the screen without touching the phone, saved the image, and wrote the time down. Then I sat at the kitchen table and opened a blank sheet of paper, because sometimes the simplest document becomes the sharpest blade. I typed a one-page timeline, dates, places, payments, and contradictions. No commentary, no emotion, just the skeletal truth. I attached screenshots as exhibits, labeled with clean numbers like an accountant building a case file. I printed 2 copies. One went into a sealed envelope addressed to Elise Hart, my lawyer. The other went into a sealed envelope addressed to the charity's board chair, not accusing, not begging, simply requesting guidance on a potential conflict of interest disclosure, with supporting documentation attached. I did not send it yet, because timing matters, and the invitation-only dinner was approaching, the one place where minutes, witnesses, and reputation would collide in real time. When I finished, I placed the envelope on the table and looked at it like it was the final chess move I had been preparing. Liana stood in the doorway, watching me, face pale, realizing the game had left the emotional arena and entered the institutional one, where her charm would not matter as much as paperwork. She asked, voice tight, what I was doing. I looked up slowly and said I was making sure the next room we entered would not belong to her lies. She took a step forward, then stopped, like she could feel the floor shifting under her feet. And as she stood there, frozen between anger and fear, my phone buzzed with a new notification. Not from the bank, not from the charity, but from an unknown number that contained only one line of text. It said that I should stop before I made an enemy I could not afford. The unknown number sat on my screen like a smear of oil on clean paper, and I stared at it long enough to feel the room tilt into a new shape. Threats are rarely about action. They are about ownership, about someone claiming they can reach you whenever they want, and the timing told me everything I needed to know about the people on the other side. Liana watched my face as if it were a weather report, trying to read whether I was scared, angry, or broken, because those were the only states she understood in me anymore. I slid the phone across the table without a word and let her read the message herself, because I wanted her reaction to be unfiltered and real. She read it once, then again, and her throat moved like she swallowed something sharp, and she immediately tried to put distance between herself and the threat by saying she had no idea who would send that. The line would have been convincing if she had not said it too fast, too cleanly, the way people speak when they have already rehearsed innocence. I did not accuse her of sending it, because accusation creates drama, and drama gives the enemy room to write a narrative about you. I simply asked her if Ryan had my number, and she hesitated for half a second before saying no, and that half second was louder than a confession. She tried to recover by claiming Ryan barely knew I existed, that she never talked about me, that the relationship, whatever it was, stayed professional, as if a pregnancy joke and a threat message were part of her definition of professionalism. I nodded and said I would forward the message to my lawyer, not to the police, not to anyone who could turn this into a spectacle, but to an attorney who understands how threats fit into a pattern when you are dealing with people who love to control outcomes. Liana's eyes flashed with panic because forwarding the message meant it would become part of a file, and files are where lies go to die. She followed me into the hallway and demanded I stop escalating, and the word escalating sounded ridiculous coming from a woman whose secret had already grown into a pregnancy claim, a workplace entanglement, and a string of financial footprints on my account. I told her I was not escalating, because escalation is emotional, and what I was doing was organizing, Because organization is what you do when you refuse to be the person who loses by reacting. Liana tried to corner me with softness, stepping closer, dropping her voice, saying she did not want enemies, saying she wanted us to have a quiet life, saying she was scared. I listened, then asked her a question that required a real answer. If she was scared, why had she laughed with her friends about me not suspecting? Her eyes hardened, and the softness vanished, because I had stepped on the one thing she could not spin. She said she was angry at me for being distant, that she felt invisible, that she needed attention, and she said it like attention was a necessity and betrayal was an understandable way to get it. That night, I did not sleep much. Not because I was spiraling, but because my mind kept running through the coming days like a checklist. The invitation-only charity dinner was close, and I could feel the institutional stage being built, the chairs, the agenda, the guest list, the quiet seriousness that makes people behave carefully. If I sent the envelope too early, they would have time to prepare a counter-narrative, time to pressure the chair, time to build an excuse. If I sent it too late, the damage would be messier, and messy outcomes always find a way to splash back. I needed the truth to land at the moment it could not be ignored, but also could not be twisted into revenge gossip. That is the balance people rarely understand, and it is why most betrayed spouses lose the plot and become the villain in someone else's story. In the morning, I met Elise Hart in her office, a clean space that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the scent of people whose job is consequences. I showed her the unknown threat message, the screenshots, the merchant alerts, the calendar contradictions, and the 2 lockscreen previews that referenced keeping the story straight. Elise's expression did not change much, but her eyes sharpened at the threat, and she asked how I had received it, and whether I had responded. I told her I had not responded, because responses are oxygen for people who want to feel powerful. She nodded and said that was good, and she advised me to preserve everything and avoid direct confrontation with Ryan. She did not tell me to become passive, she told me to become predictable, because predictability makes you hard to frame as unstable. She also told me something else that hit like a cold splash. If Liana was pregnant and paternity was uncertain, I needed to protect myself legally now, not later, because pregnancy makes people gamble harder, and gamblers become dangerous when their chips run out. When I left Elise's office, my phone buzzed again, but this time it was Liana, calling repeatedly, which meant she was either panicking or performing. I let it ring out, then texted her that all communication could stay calm and documented, and that we could speak later in the day. It was a small boundary, and boundaries are what make manipulators feel trapped, because boundaries limit their ability to improvise. She replied with a long message, accusing me of trying to destroy her, saying Ryan was a good man, saying her friends were the problem, saying she could make everything right if I stopped threatening people. I read it twice and saved it, because she had accidentally acknowledged the existence of people being threatened, and that meant she knew more about the unknown number than she wanted to admit. That afternoon, something shifted in my environment in a way that did not come from Liana directly. A coworker I barely spoke to sent me a message, friendly on the surface, asking if everything was okay at home, mentioning that they had heard I seemed stressed, that I had been acting intense lately. The words felt unnatural, like someone had planted a concern and watched it spread through polite mouths. It was subtle, but I recognized the shape of a smear campaign beginning, the kind that starts with faux empathy and ends with questions about your temperament. Ryan's power was not physical, it was narrative power, the ability to make a room doubt you before you even speak. I did not reply with anger. I replied with a calm sentence that everything was fine, and that I was handling personal matters privately. Then I forwarded the message to Elise as well, because patterns are more persuasive than single incidents. That evening, Liana returned home with a different energy, the stiff brightness of someone who has had a long meeting and been instructed on what to say. She told me Ryan wanted to speak with me like adults, and she framed it as a generous offer, as if the man who had been hiding behind her lies was now offering me a handshake. I asked her where the meeting would happen, and she said a hotel lounge downtown, and the irony almost made me laugh. I told her no, and I told her any communication could go through attorneys. Liana snapped that I was scared, and she said it like a taunt, like a teenager accusing someone of being afraid of a fight. I told her I was not scared of Ryan. I was simply refusing to give him the kind of direct contact that powerful men later twist into harassment. She called me paranoid, but her eyes betrayed her, because she understood exactly what I meant. The next day was the charity committee planning session, the one that fed into the invitation-only dinner. My name was still on the sponsor list, which meant I had a legitimate reason to attend, but I did not attend, because attending would make the situation personal and loud. Instead, I did something quieter and cleaner. I printed the one-page timeline again, but this time, I removed any personal language and kept only dates, locations, payments, and contradictions. I attached the merchant alert screenshots and the rideshare receipts, but I did not label them as adultery. I labeled them as potential conflict and misuse of sponsor-related optics. I sealed everything in a clear sleeve because clear sleeves make documents look official, and official-looking documents change the temperature of rooms. Then I wrote a short cover letter asking for guidance on disclosure policies, and I addressed it to the board chair and secretary jointly, because sending it to two people reduces the chance it quietly disappears. I still did not send it. I placed it in my work bag and went to the office, letting the day run, letting Liana think I was frozen. That is the thing about calm revenge. It looks like weakness to people who only understand explosions. At noon, Elise texted me that she had filed preliminary separation papers, not as a dramatic strike, but as a protective measure, establishing a formal timeline before narratives could be reversed. The filing receipt number appeared on my screen, and I saved it. The receipt was not a weapon, it was a shield, because once things become official, the liar's ability to claim you are making it up diminishes. You can call a spouse crazy, but you cannot easily call a stamped receipt crazy. That night, Liana went out again, supposedly to meet friends, but she did not say which friends, and vagueness is always a sign of strategy. I did not follow her. I did not call. I did not ask, because chasing is what she expected from me, and expectation is where manipulators feel safe. Instead, I sat at the table and prepared for the dinner event like it was a hearing. I printed the charity agenda email that showed both Liana and Ryan listed, and I highlighted their names with a marker. Not because highlighting changes facts, but because highlighting trains the eye. I printed the calendar conflict header that showed Liana's committee meeting overlap with a rideshare drop-off at the hotel lounge, and I stapled it behind the agenda. I printed the merchant alert for that same night, and I stapled it behind the calendar page. I wrote the dates again on paper, signed the bottom, and placed everything into a second sleeve labeled with the upcoming dinner date. Near midnight, Liana returned, smelling like expensive air and fake confidence. She asked what I was doing, and I told her I was making sure we both lived in the same reality. She laughed bitterly and said I would never be believed, because Ryan was admired and she was liked, and I was just the husband who could not keep his wife happy. The line was cruel, but it was also informative, because it told me the narrative she planned to sell if things went public. I looked at her and asked quietly whether she had already told people I was controlling. She shrugged and said she told people the truth, that I was cold, that I was obsessive, that I kept records like a threat. I nodded and said records are only a threat to liars. Liana flinched, then walked into the bedroom, slamming the door again, like noise could substitute for power. The invitation-only dinner arrived on a Friday evening, held in a private room of a community center that served as an elegant venue for donors, committee members, and corporate sponsors. It was not glamorous, but it was structured, and structure is where deception fails. I arrived early, not to cause a scene, but to blend in as a sponsor representative with paperwork to deliver. The room was being set with place cards and small programs, and a staff member directed me toward the board secretary, a composed woman with a tight smile. I introduced myself calmly and handed her the sealed sleeve and cover letter, saying I had a concern about disclosure and wanted guidance on process. I did not accuse anyone by name in the first sentence, because accusations trigger defenses, but documentation triggers procedures. The secretary took the sleeve and looked at the label, then looked at me, and I could see her professionalism tighten because she understood this was not gossip. She told me the chair would review it, and she asked if I wanted to speak with the chair directly. I said I was available if needed, but I preferred to let procedure work, because procedure is impartial, and impartiality is my friend. She nodded and asked me to wait. While I waited, the guests began to arrive, and I saw Liana enter with two of her friends, dressed carefully, laughing too loudly, trying to look untouchable. She froze when she saw me, and her face tightened into a smile that looked like pain. She approached and asked what I was doing there, and I said I was attending as a sponsor representative, which was true, and truth sounds like an insult to someone living on lies. She hissed that this was not the time, that I was embarrassing her, and I told her she had been embarrassing me for weeks. I was just finally doing it with paperwork. Then Ryan arrived, and he did not come in with a lover's swagger. He came in with a boss's calm, the kind that assumes rooms will accommodate him. He spotted me immediately, because of course he did, and he gave a polite nod that did not reach his eyes. Liana moved subtly closer to him, not touching, not overtly, but close enough to signal alliance. I watched the triangle form, and I felt no urge to erupt, because eruptions are what they wanted. Ryan approached with an HR-trained smile and asked if we could talk privately for a moment. I told him that would not be appropriate here, and I kept my voice even. He said he respected my feelings, but he believed there were misunderstandings, and he wanted to clear them up. I told him I was not interested in feelings. I was interested in facts, and the facts were already in a sealed sleeve with the secretary. His smile tightened, and for a brief moment the mask slipped, revealing irritation, the kind powerful people feel when they realize they cannot control the script. He asked what I had submitted, and I told him I had submitted a request for guidance on disclosure policy, supported by documentation of repeated overlaps and resource misuse, and that I trusted the chair to handle it. Ryan's jaw tightened again, and he said I was making a serious accusation. I corrected him calmly and said I had made a serious submission, and there was a difference. People nearby began to notice the tension, and Liana's friends stopped laughing, suddenly aware they were standing too close to a conflict they could not dismiss as drama. Liana whispered that I was ruining her life, and I looked at her and said she had gambled her life on a boss and a joke, and now the chips were being counted in public. The chair called for a brief recess before dinner, citing a need to review a procedural matter, and the words sounded neutral, but the room felt the shift. Guests murmured, servers paused, and the board secretary walked toward the chair with the sleeve held like a fragile object. Ryan's eyes flicked toward Liana, and I saw the smallest crack in their coordination, the silent argument that happens when two guilty people realize the room might not protect them. Liana stared at me with raw hatred, and I stared back with quiet certainty, because hatred is loud, but it is not evidence. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, and when I glanced down, I saw a new message from the unknown number. It was shorter than the last, and it carried the weight of desperation. It said that if I went through with this, Liana would tell everyone I abused her, and no one would listen to a man with paperwork when a woman cries on command. I did not respond to the new threat message, because responding would have been the only proof they could claim I was engaging in some kind of battle. I simply saved it, took a screenshot, and forwarded it to Elise with the time visible, because timing is the skeleton of credibility. Then, I slid the phone back into my pocket and kept my posture steady, letting the room do what rooms always do when a scandal is about to hatch. People pretend not to notice, but their eyes keep drifting, and their ears keep stretching, and the air thickens with curiosity and fear. Liana's friends, the same women who had laughed in our living room, suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into the walls. Their laughter had been brave in private, but public consequences make cowards of most people. The chair returned after the recess, face composed, voice formal, and announced they would adjust the agenda and begin with a brief disclosure process before dinner. The chair did not say affair, did not say pregnant, did not say husband, because institutions never speak in human language when they can speak in policy. The chair asked Liana, as a committee member, to confirm whether she had any undisclosed personal relationship with any sponsor liaison that could reasonably be seen as a conflict of interest. Liana's face went pale in the exact way I had seen before, a pale that looks like someone is suddenly aware their body cannot lie as easily as their mouth. She glanced at Ryan, then back at the chair, and she said no, in a voice that tried to sound offended. Ryan immediately stepped in, calm and authoritative, saying the suggestion was inappropriate, that he maintained professional boundaries, and that any insinuation was harmful to the organization. The chair listened without emotion, then said they had received documentation indicating repeated private meetings, overlapping schedules, and the use of sponsor-related venues and expenses in ways that created the appearance of impropriety. The chair did not accuse them of sex because sex is messy and hard to prove, but the appearance of impropriety is enough to trigger action in the right room. Liana's friends shifted uncomfortably, and one of them looked down at her hands like she was suddenly ashamed of having them. Ryan's face tightened again, and he asked what documentation. The chair said they would not display everything publicly, but they would read key elements for the record and invite the parties to respond. The board secretary stepped forward and read dates, places, and payments from my one-page timeline, the neutral facts that sound like a bell tolling when you are guilty. The secretary mentioned rideshare receipts tied to my account, merchant alerts from a hotel lounge, and the committee agenda email showing Ryan and Liana scheduled together on a night Liana claimed she was elsewhere. No dramatic accusations, no emotional language, just a clean list that made it difficult to laugh. The chair asked Liana to explain the overlap. Liana tried to speak, but her voice caught, and she began to cry, because crying is the oldest shield in the world. She said she felt attacked, that she was being punished for rumors, that her husband was jealous and unstable, and she implied I was controlling in private. It was exactly what the threat message predicted, and hearing her say it out loud made my spine stiffen, not with rage, but with clarity. She was willing to burn me to protect herself, even in front of people who had never met me. The chair asked whether she had documentation supporting her claim of instability or abuse. Liana hesitated because she did not have real documentation. She had narrative, and narrative collapses when asked for proof in a formal room. Ryan tried to rescue her by saying the situation was personal and should not be handled in the organization, that this was harassment disguised as concern. The chair's tone remained neutral as they responded that the organization had a duty to protect donor trust and avoid conflicts of interest, and that the documentation provided justified a review. The chair then asked Ryan a direct question. Had he been meeting privately with Liana outside committee work? Ryan said he had met with her occasionally for mentorship and logistics, and he framed it as normal. The chair asked if he had disclosed that mentorship relationship to the committee. Ryan said it was not required. The chair calmly replied that the question of requirement would be assessed, and for now, the relationship should be disclosed for transparency. Liana's friends began whispering to each other, and I could feel the loyalty cracking, because friends love drama, until drama asks them to pick a side. The chair announced that, pending review, Liana would be removed from the committee, and Ryan would be asked to step back as sponsor liaison, with an interim liaison assigned. There was a murmur through the room, the kind that sounds like a crowd smelling blood but pretending to be polite. Liana's eyes widened, and she shook her head as if the room had become unreal. Ryan's face hardened into something colder, and he said this was an overreaction. The chair responded that it was a risk management step, and that the review would continue through formal channels. This was not the end I wanted yet, because removal from a committee is a bruise, not a bone break, and I knew Ryan's power could still twist stories. The justice had to be anchored to something that held beyond one charity room. That was why Elise had filed the separation papers, and why I had documented threats. I stepped forward, not to speak emotionally, but to deliver one more clean fact into the room. I told the chair in a steady voice that I had received threatening messages intended to stop me from bringing this concern forward, and that I had preserved them and forwarded them to counsel. I did not accuse Ryan directly. I did not point at Liana. I simply stated the existence of threats, because threats transform a jealous spouse story into a coercion and intimidation story, and institutions hate intimidation because it creates liability. The chair's eyes sharpened slightly, and they asked if I could provide the messages through counsel. I said yes, and I stepped back. Liana snapped, voice rising, insisting I was lying, insisting I was framing her, insisting I was trying to destroy her unborn child's future. She said, "unborn child," like a weapon, like a guilt bomb she expected me to defuse. The room reacted to that phrase, because pregnancy makes people soften instinctively, and Liana knew it. But the chair did not soften, because chairs are trained to protect institutions, not emotions. The chair asked, with calm firmness, whether Liana was confirming she was pregnant. Liana froze, realizing she had said too much, and her silence filled the room like smoke. Ryan stepped in quickly, saying her personal health was not relevant. The chair replied that if pregnancy was being invoked as part of the narrative, it became relevant to the extent it influenced potential coercion or conflicts. Liana tried to backtrack, saying she had misspoken, that she was stressed, that it was complicated. The complication sounded like guilt, and the room could feel it. The chair ended the disclosure segment and announced dinner would proceed, but the review would be initiated immediately, and that all parties were asked not to discuss the matter publicly until the committee had assessed it. That last instruction sounded like protection, but it also sounded like a leash, because now Ryan and Liana were being warned not to weaponize the room's gossip. As people began moving to their seats, the tension did not dissolve, it simply changed form. Conversations became hushed, eyes kept darting, and Liana's friends looked like they wanted to crawl under the tablecloth. Liana remained standing, trembling, and Ryan leaned in close, speaking to her without touching, the way a man coaches a crisis without wanting his fingerprints on it. Then the second major twist arrived, and it did not come from Ryan or Liana, but from one of Liana's own friends, the one who had looked ashamed earlier. She approached the board secretary quietly, holding her phone, and she asked to speak privately. I watched from a distance, feeling the room narrow, because betrayal always breeds more betrayal. The friend handed over her phone, and the secretary's expression changed slightly as she read whatever was on the screen. The secretary walked to the chair and whispered, and the chair's face tightened in a way that was still controlled but unmistakably serious. The chair called for another brief pause, and the room stilled again, now fully aware this was no longer a small disclosure issue. The chair announced they had received new information from an attendee that suggested the situation involved not only a conflict of interest, but also potential misuse of organizational access and manipulation of committee processes. The chair did not describe it in detail, but the implication hit like cold water. Ryan's eyes flicked sharply toward Liana's friend, and for a moment the polished mentor mask slipped, revealing panic. Liana's friend looked terrified but determined, like someone finally realizing the joke they laughed at had teeth. The chair requested that Ryan and Liana step into a side room with the secretary for an immediate preliminary discussion, and that the rest of the guests remain seated. The room buzzed with whispers, because nothing makes people more attentive than being told to wait. Liana tried to refuse, claiming this was humiliating, claiming she felt sick, claiming she needed air. The chair's voice stayed steady as they said refusal would be noted and could influence the review. Ryan, for all his power, understood institutional leverage, and he guided Liana toward the side room, not gently, but decisively, because he knew the chair had the power to formally record refusal. As they disappeared through the door, I watched Liana's friends shrink into their seats, their faces tight with regret. The friend who had handed over the phone stared at the table like she was watching her own future flicker. I did not go to the door, I did not try to listen, I did not chase, because my role was not to be dramatic. My role was to let the 1,000 truths do their work, each small truth adding weight until the structure collapsed on its own. After 15 minutes, the door opened, and Ryan emerged first, face composed but rigid, followed by Liana, whose eyes were red and unfocused. The chair stood and addressed the room with the measured tone of someone finishing a procedure. They announced that the charity would initiate a formal review, that Ryan's sponsor liaison role was suspended immediately pending investigation, and that Liana's committee membership was terminated effective now. The chair also announced that the organization would notify relevant corporate compliance contacts about the suspension, because the situation involved a corporate representative and potential policy breaches. It was not a prison sentence, not a public shaming spectacle, but it was something stronger than gossip. It was an institutional action within 30 days, triggered by documented proof. Ryan's face remained controlled, but I could see the fury in the tightness of his jaw. Liana looked like a person who had just realized the protection she believed in was conditional. She stared at me with pure hatred, and she mouthed something I could not hear, but her body language said it clearly. She blamed me for her own choices. I did not respond. I simply nodded politely to the chair, thanked them for taking the concern seriously, and said my counsel would provide any additional documentation requested. Then I turned away, because the final power move in a confrontation is often leaving before the room can demand a performance from you. Outside, in the cool night air, my phone buzzed again, and for a moment I expected another threat. Instead, it was Elise, saying she had received my forwarded messages and the timing was helpful, and she advised me to return home and avoid any direct contact with Liana tonight. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel without starting it, letting the quiet settle over me like a blanket. I felt no victory rush, no triumphant surge, because revenge is not a party when you are the person who actually cared. What I felt was a hard, clean relief. The relief of knowing that the truth had landed in a place where it could not be laughed away. When I reached home, Liana was already there, pacing, eyes wild, and the moment she saw me, she exploded, shouting that I had ruined her, that I had humiliated her in front of donors, that I had destroyed her career path. She said Ryan would never forgive her, and she said it like losing Ryan was the real tragedy. I stood near the doorway, keeping distance, and I told her I had not ruined her. I had simply stopped hiding her. She called me cruel, she called me obsessive, she called me abusive, and I noticed she was already using the same words the threat message promised. I told her calmly that she could make any accusation she wanted, but accusations without proof would not survive a lawyer's questions. She demanded I drop the separation filing, and I told her the filing existed because of her choices, not my mood. Then she tried a final pivot, softer now, voice shaking, saying she was scared, saying she did not want to be alone, saying she could fix this if I stayed. I looked at her and realized something that felt like a final nail. She had not apologized once for laughing about me not suspecting. She had not shown one moment of real accountability. She only reacted to consequences. I told her, quietly, that the marriage was over, and that from this point forward, our contact would be structured through counsel. She began to cry again, and she said the baby might be mine, and she begged me not to abandon her. I told her that if the baby was mine, I would handle responsibilities through legal channels and proper testing, but I would not stay married to a woman who treated me like a joke. She lunged toward the table where my notebook and sleeves were stacked, trying to grab them, trying to tear them, trying to destroy the paper version of her reality. I moved quickly, not violently, simply stepping between her and the documents, and I held the stack against my chest while backing away. She reached again, nails scraping at the clear sleeves, and I raised my voice just enough to stop her, telling her to step back. For a second, her eyes looked almost feral, like she would rather burn everything than face it. Then she stopped, breathing hard, and her shoulders slumped, as if the fight drained out of her all at once. I picked up my bag, took the sleeves and the notebook, and walked to the door. Liana followed, sobbing, demanding I stay, demanding I talk, demanding I admit I did this to hurt her. I turned at the threshold and told her the simplest truth I had left. I told her I did not do this to hurt her. I did it to end the lies, because lies were already hurting me every day. Then I left, because the only way to stop a liar from rewriting you is to remove yourself from their stage. As I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed one more time, and this time it was not a threat. It was a notification from Elise's office, confirming the next scheduled mediation session date and time, and the message included a simple line. The charity chair had already contacted corporate compliance to document the suspension. I stared at the screen and felt the story lock into place, not as an emotional ending, but as a logical one. The room had chosen policy over charm, minutes over tears, and documents over rumor. Behind me, through the apartment door, I could hear Liana collapsing into sobs, the sound of someone finally meeting the consequences she thought would never reach her. And as I walked toward the elevator, I realized the most brutal part of revenge is not the public moment, it is the quiet moment afterward, when you understand the truth did not just expose her, it also exposed how little she ever respected you. I spent the first night in a small business hotel off the freeway, not because it was comfortable, but because it was anonymous, and anonymity is what you need when your home turns into a stage for someone else's performance. The room smelled like detergent and stale air conditioning, and the silence had that thin, buzzing quality you only notice when you are no longer living inside somebody's noise. I laid the clear sleeves on the desk like they were fragile artifacts. Then I opened my notebook and wrote 3 lines in block letters. No private contact, no reactions, only records. It was not a mantra for bravery. It was a leash for discipline, because I could already feel the world trying to pull me into the kind of messy fight that makes liars look like victims. By morning, the situation had evolved in the predictable way that betrayal always evolves once consequences land. Liana began calling, not once, but in waves, alternating between frantic apologies and scorching accusations, as if she believed volume could create reality. When I did not answer, she switched tactics and started texting long paragraphs that were equal parts pleading and threatening, and I saved everyone without replying. Then the messages came from unfamiliar numbers, short and sharp, hinting that I should back off, warning me that people talk, implying that Ryan had friends who could make my life hard. None of it was explicit enough to feel like a police matter, and I did not want police involved anyway, because police turn private collapses into public theater. What mattered was pattern, and patterns are best handled through counsel and procedure, not through adrenaline. Elise arranged the first mediation intake meeting for the following week, and she warned me that Liana would try to weaponize emotions, pregnancy, and any story she could create about my temperament. The plan was not to argue feelings. The plan was to establish a timeline, document communications, and set boundaries that would hold even if Liana decided to make herself the protagonist of a tragedy. Elise also recommended I change a few practical routines, not as paranoia, but as basic caution. Use public places for any necessary exchange. Keep communication through written channels. Avoid late-night conversations that could be twisted. In other words, live like someone who understands how easy it is for a liar to turn a moment into a claim. At work, the smear began to thicken in a way that was still polite but unmistakably coordinated. A colleague asked if everything was okay, then added that they had heard things were intense at home. A manager suggested I take a day off, not as kindness, but as a subtle message that my private life had become office weather. A friend from another department sent me a link to an anonymous post in a local community group, written vaguely enough to be deniable, describing a controlling husband who kept evidence folders and threatened a woman's career after she made a mistake. The details were too close to be coincidence, and the tone was designed to make strangers nod along. I did not respond publicly, because public arguments are where narrative wins over truth, and I knew Ryan's entire advantage lived in his ability to cultivate consensus. Instead, I did something quieter that made my stomach tighten with its own cruelty. I took screenshots of the post and the comments. Then I wrote down the names of the people who echoed it with certainty, because certainty without facts is a signal of influence. I forwarded the screenshots to Elise, and she replied that it was helpful as evidence of a coordinated pressure campaign, especially paired with the threatening texts. The word campaign made me feel briefly sick, because it implied planning, and planning implies intent, and intent is what separates a messy affair from a deliberate attempt to control and punish. 3 days later, the second wave came, and this one was aimed at my finances, because money is where most couples keep shared vulnerability. A notification from my bank pinged early in the morning, informing me that a joint discretionary spending limit change had been requested, and that an appointment was required to review account access due to suspicious activity. My name was on the account, my history was clean, and yet here was a friction point appearing exactly when Ryan had been suspended and Liana had been removed from the committee. It felt like a hand reaching through the system, not hacking, not illegal access, but influence and intimidation, the kind that turns ordinary processes into pressure. Elise immediately advised me to attend the bank appointment with documentation and to request separation of discretionary spending through civil channels, because the moment money becomes a weapon, you stop pretending it is a private issue. I met the bank representative in a glass-walled office that smelled like carpet shampoo and stress. The representative was polite but cautious, because caution is what people wear when they believe there is trouble behind a name. I showed the representative my filing receipt and Elise's letter confirming separation proceedings, and I requested that all new discretionary changes require dual confirmation in writing until the court process clarified access. The representative nodded and printed a summary of recent account alerts and requests, and I asked for a copy. It was not dramatic, but it was real, and real is what I needed. When I left, I had another piece of paper, another small brick in the wall I was building between my life and Liana's chaos. That afternoon, Liana appeared at my office building, because of course she did, because people like her believe in surprise as a weapon. Security called me downstairs and said a woman claimed she needed to speak urgently with her husband. I told security I would not come down, and that any communication could happen through counsel. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number containing a photo of Liana standing in the lobby, crying theatrically, her hands pressed to her face, and the caption read like a threat wrapped in pity. "This is what you want people to see." My chest tightened, not with guilt, but with disgust, because she was not asking for reconciliation, she was asking for optics. I forwarded the message to Elise and stayed at my desk, letting Liana perform for whoever she wanted, because performances fade when the audience gets bored. That night, I received a formal email from the charity chair, brief and careful, acknowledging receipt of my documentation and confirming that corporate compliance had been notified about Ryan's suspension pending review. The email also requested one more item: any evidence supporting the claim of intimidation related to the disclosure. I replied through Elise, attaching screenshots of the threatening messages, the timing, and the bank appointment notice, not as accusations, but as proof of pressure coinciding with institutional action. I did not want revenge that required theatrics. I wanted consequences that required signatures. The next morning, the midweek mediation intake arrived, and I walked into a neutral office building that felt like every civil dispute ever filed: bland walls, muted lighting, chairs arranged to prevent drama. Liana arrived late, eyes red, posture wounded, dressed like someone who understood exactly what kind of sympathy clothing could attract. She did not look at me at first, and when she did, her stare was full of fury, disguised as grief. The mediator began with basic questions about separation terms, assets, and temporary boundaries. Liana answered in a soft voice that made her sound fragile, but the content of her answers was a quiet attempt to paint me as unstable and punitive. She said I collected evidence obsessively. She said I tracked her. She said I tried to ruin her professionally. The words were careful, chosen to imply wrongdoing without making a direct claim that would require proof. When it was my turn, I did not argue her emotions, and I did not accuse her of anything new. I simply stated the facts. I overheard her statement about pregnancy and me not suspecting. I documented household-level evidence that contradicted her cover stories. I submitted the information to an institution where conflict disclosure mattered, and I filed separation papers to establish boundaries. I also stated that I had received intimidation messages telling me to stop, and I had preserved them. The mediator asked Liana if she could provide any proof of tracking or illegal surveillance. Liana hesitated, then said she felt like she was being watched because I always knew details. The mediator responded that feelings were not evidence, and I watched Liana's face tighten as she realized the room would not let her cry her way into a legal advantage. Then the pregnancy became the center of gravity, because that is what Liana had been saving as her emergency exit. She said she was pregnant and did not know what to do, and she implied the baby might be mine, and she spoke like that uncertainty should obligate me to stay. The mediator asked about paternity and timelines, and Liana's answers became slippery, because slippery is what happens when you are trying to keep multiple stories alive. Elise requested that paternity testing be arranged through proper legal and medical channels, and the mediator noted it as a practical step, not as a moral verdict. Liana reacted as if requesting a test was an insult, but it was simply structure, and structure was the one thing she could not manipulate easily. After the session, Liana followed me into the hallway, voice rising, accusing me of humiliating her again, accusing me of turning the mediator against her, accusing me of loving paperwork more than people. I did not engage. I walked past her and into the elevator, and the doors closed on her face, and I felt a harsh kind of peace, because the only way to stop being trapped in someone's emotional storm is to stop trying to calm it. 2 nights later, I learned how deep Ryan's influence ran, and I learned it through something as small as a calendar notification. A corporate all-hands town hall appeared on my work calendar, not unusual, but the agenda included a section about professional conduct and organizational reputation. It was generic, the kind of topic companies discuss when they want to warn people without naming names. Yet in the office, the whispers grew louder, and I saw people glance at me with the subtle caution reserved for someone who might be a problem. Ryan's suspension was not just a committee matter anymore, it was becoming a corporate cleanliness issue, and corporate cleanliness makes everyone paranoid. That same evening, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I recognized now as one of Liana's friends, the one who had handed over her phone at the charity dinner. The message was short and trembling, and it said she was sorry, and she wanted to give me something because she could not sleep. She asked if we could meet in a public place quickly before she lost her nerve. I agreed, but I chose the location, a busy cafe near the courthouse, a place where nobody can accuse you of cornering someone. When she arrived, her hands shook around her cup, and she looked like someone who had finally realized she had been laughing at a loaded gun. She told me she had not just witnessed Liana bragging, she had also seen Ryan send messages instructing Liana on what to say if anyone asked questions. And she had screenshots because she had forwarded them to herself when she started feeling uneasy. She did not hand me the phone like a gift. She handed it like a confession. I did not celebrate, because there was nothing to celebrate about another person's collapse, but I felt the logic click into place. This was not a simple affair with messy emotions. This was an organized attempt to control disclosure, control optics, and control the narrative about me. It meant my earlier fear was right. Ryan was not just sleeping with my wife, he was using her as a tool, and she had agreed because attention felt like power to her. I asked the friend to send the screenshots to Elise directly, because chain of custody matters even in civil disputes, and she did it immediately, eyes wet, voice cracking. She also told me one more thing, and it landed like a final brick. Ryan had been telling Liana that if I tried to expose anything, they could paint me as unstable and push for a protective order, not because I had harmed anyone, but because the accusation itself could isolate me. Liana had laughed about it at first. Then later she started repeating phrases like she was practicing them. I left the cafe with my jaw tight, because being betrayed is one thing, but being strategically framed is another, and it makes the world feel colder. That night, Elise called and said the new screenshots were significant, not because they proved sex, but because they showed coaching and manipulation, and coaching is what makes institutions act fast. The charity review, the corporate compliance process, the mediation, all of it could now connect as one timeline: affair, intimidation, narrative management, and retaliation. Elise also told me the corporate all-hands town hall might become the next public arena, not because I would speak, but because corporate HR loves formal records, and formal records are where Ryan's suspension could become career-ending. I looked at the sleeves on my desk and realized I was no longer just defending myself from a cheating spouse. I was dealing with two people who believed they could rewrite me into a villain to protect their own positions. And that meant the next move had to be clean, quiet, and irreversible. Because if you give people like that even one emotional misstep, they will turn it into a story you cannot undo. The corporate town hall took place on a Thursday morning, and the building felt like a museum before opening. Polished surfaces, quiet corridors, everyone moving with controlled purpose. I did not have a role on the agenda, and I did not want one, because the moment you become a voice, you become a target. My goal was not to tell my truth to an audience. My goal was to make sure the truth existed in records that could survive spin. Elise had already sent the screenshots from Liana's friend to the charity chair and to the corporate compliance contact listed in the chair's email, framed as supporting documentation of intimidation and narrative coaching. She did it with neutral language, because neutral language is what institutions trust. When the town hall began, the HR director spoke about standards, conduct, and reputational risk, and their phrasing was carefully broad. Yet every time they said conflict disclosure, abuse of power, and coercion, I could feel the room's awareness sharpen, because people understand subtext even when they pretend not to. There was also a segment about reporting concerns without fear of retaliation, and that line hit me with bitter irony, because retaliation had already arrived in the form of whispers, posts, and bank friction. After the town hall, I noticed something subtle but telling. A compliance representative stopped by my manager's desk, then glanced in my direction, and their eyes held that measured look of someone connecting dots. By afternoon, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize, and when I answered, the voice on the other end introduced themselves as corporate compliance, asking if I could speak briefly about documentation I had submitted through counsel. The fact they said through counsel told me Elise's package had landed with weight. I agreed to a call later, with Elise present, because I was done being alone in rooms that could be turned against me. The call was short, formal, and almost clinical. Compliance asked whether I had any direct interactions with Ryan since his suspension, whether I had been threatened, and whether I had documentation of coaching messages. Elise answered carefully, confirming we had preserved messages and screenshots and that we would provide originals through appropriate channels. Compliance thanked us and ended the call with the kind of tone that suggests a process is already moving. I sat there afterward, staring at the wall, feeling the strange calm of someone watching a machine begin to turn. That evening, Liana did what desperate people always do when they feel their protection slipping. She tried to reach my parents. I learned it through my mother's worried call, asking why Liana was crying and saying I had abandoned her while she was pregnant. The story was designed to pierce family loyalty, because family loyalty is one of the few things liars cannot replace with charm. I did not explode at my mother, and I did not plead. I explained slowly that I had filed separation paperwork, that the pregnancy claim was disputed and would be handled through proper testing, and that Liana was attempting to control the narrative through emotional pressure. My mother went quiet, then asked whether there was proof. I told her there was proof of lies and proof of intimidation, and that I did not want her pulled into it. I could hear disappointment in her silence, but I also heard something else. The slow shift of a person realizing Liana's tears might be a tactic, not a tragedy. The next day, the charity chair emailed Elise again, stating that the review had escalated to an emergency ethics meeting due to new documentation of intimidation and coaching. The meeting would occur in 3 days, and the chair requested that I be present only as a sponsor liaison for record clarity, not to speak emotionally. The public arena was becoming sharper now, and the stakes were real. If the ethics meeting recorded evidence received and intimidation noted, Ryan's suspension would likely harden into termination, and Liana's social scaffolding would collapse with him. I felt a brief flicker of satisfaction. Then I hated myself for it, because satisfaction in these situations is always tangled with grief. Still, I did not choose the machine. I simply fed it facts, and facts do what facts do. On the night before the ethics meeting, Liana found my hotel, and I realized she did it the moment I saw her car idling across the parking lot, headlights off, like she was waiting for a moment to ambush me. I walked from the lobby toward my room and felt my skin tighten, because this was not reconciliation energy, this was pressure energy. She stepped out of the car, face tense, and rushed toward me with the kind of urgency that looks like love from a distance, but feels like threat up close. She demanded to talk, demanded I stop the attack, demanded I call Elise and tell her to pull the documentation. I told her no, and I kept my voice even. She said Ryan would destroy me, that he knew people, that my job would be gone, that my reputation would be shredded, and she said it like she was warning me for my own good. Then she pivoted instantly and begged again, saying she was scared, saying she needed me, saying she could not do this alone. Watching her switch between menace and pleading was like watching someone flip between masks, and it made my stomach turn. I told her the only conversation we could have was in the presence of counsel, and that any attempt to corner me in a parking lot would be documented. She laughed bitterly and said I was recording her in my head like a robot. I said nothing. I simply walked toward the entrance and let the cameras above the door see what they would see, a man leaving and a woman following. It was not miracle surveillance, it was basic public space, and basic public space protects you when someone tries to rewrite a moment. Liana grabbed my sleeve, not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to create a scene, and she hissed that she would tell everyone I pushed her if I did not stop. The threat was quiet, but it was clear, and it made my heart thud once, not from fear, but from the cold realization that she was willing to manufacture anything. I pulled my arm free without force and stepped back, keeping distance. I told her, clearly, to stop touching me. She froze for a second, then began crying loudly, turning her face toward the lobby doors as if she wanted an audience. A couple walked out and glanced at us, and I felt the moment stretching, trying to become a story. I did the only thing that saved me. I lifted my phone, not to record her like a stalker, but to call Elise and put the call on speaker so my words existed in a professional context. I told Elise where I was, told her Liana had followed me, and told her Liana was threatening to make false claims. Liana's crying faltered for a second when she heard Elise's name, because she understood lawyers kill theater. She backed up, wiped her face, and suddenly tried to sound calm, like a reasonable woman who had simply come to talk. Elise instructed me to go inside, stay in public, and ask hotel staff to document that Liana was asked to leave if she continued. I did exactly that. Liana glared at me with venom, then stormed back to her car, slamming the door hard enough to make the whole vehicle shudder. When she left, I stood in the lobby and realized my hands were shaking slightly, not because I was weak, but because my body had finally caught up to the fact that my life had become a legal chessboard. I slept poorly, waking every hour, listening for footsteps, imagining new posts, new calls, new attempts to corner me into a reaction. In the morning, Elise texted me that the hotel incident mattered and to write down everything while memory was fresh, including exact times and what was said. I did it immediately because when you are dealing with liars, your memory becomes evidence only if you treat it like evidence. The ethics meeting took place in a conference room at the community center, and the atmosphere was colder than the dinner, because this time the room had teeth. The chair sat at the head of a table with the board secretary, a compliance liaison on a video call, and a neutral facilitator whose job was to keep the process clean. Ryan arrived looking composed, but I could see the strain around his eyes, the fatigue of a man who had been forced into accountability against his will. Liana arrived as well, and she looked smaller than before, her confidence replaced by a tense desperation that made her seem older. She avoided my eyes, then looked at me suddenly with a glare that carried pure blame. The facilitator began by stating that the purpose was to assess conflict disclosure failures, intimidation, and conduct issues tied to organizational trust. Then the secretary read the timeline again, but this time they included the coaching screenshots from Liana's friend, with names redacted but content clear. The content described how to respond if questioned, how to paint me as unstable, how to deny facts, how to delay until the next meeting, and how to make the room feel sorry for Liana. Listening to those messages read aloud in an official context felt like watching a parasite exposed under bright light. Ryan's face did not crack, but his jaw clenched so hard I thought he might break a tooth. Liana's breathing became shallow, and her hands twisted in her lap like she was trying to wring out guilt. The chair asked Ryan to respond. Ryan said the messages were taken out of context, that he was advising Liana on managing stress, that he never intended intimidation. The facilitator asked why the messages included strategy about framing me as unstable and suggesting protective orders. Ryan hesitated, and that hesitation was the first real crack I had seen. He tried to pivot, saying he felt threatened by my campaign, and he claimed he was protecting himself. The facilitator asked whether he had sent any messages to my number or instructed anyone to contact me. Ryan denied it. The chair then asked about the intimidation messages, and Elise, speaking through counsel presence, confirmed we had preserved them and could provide metadata and timestamps showing they arrived immediately after key institutional actions. The chair did not need to prove Ryan wrote them to take them seriously, because intimidation connected to a conflict review is a red flag any board understands. Then Liana was asked to speak, and she did what she always did when cornered. She cried and tried to turn the room into a sympathy court. She said she was pregnant, she said she was scared, She said she did not know what she was doing. She said Ryan manipulated her, and she tried to imply she was a victim of power. The twist was that for the first time, her victim performance did not have the same effect, because the coaching screenshots had poisoned the well. The facilitator asked whether she had laughed about me not suspecting, and whether she had repeated scripted phrases. Liana tried to deny, then stumbled, then said she had been joking, and the word joking landed like rot in a clean room. The facilitator asked whether she had threatened to make false claims against me. Liana's face went rigid, and she tried to say I was lying, but her denial sounded weak, because she had already used the same fear tactics in mediation. The chair announced the immediate outcome. Ryan's liaison role would be terminated, and a report would be filed with corporate compliance recommending formal disciplinary action due to abuse of position, coaching a subordinate or committee member to manipulate disclosure, and intimidation concerns. Liana's removal from the committee was reaffirmed, and the chair stated they would document the intimidation evidence and provide it to relevant contacts if requested. It was not prison, it was not police, but it was a clean professional collapse, the kind that makes powerful men suddenly feel small. Ryan's face stayed composed, but his eyes flashed with fury, and for a moment I saw something raw in him, the rage of a man who believed rules were for other people. As the meeting concluded, Liana stood abruptly, shaking, and she looked at me with a hate so sharp it almost felt physical. She said my name like a curse. Then she turned toward the chair and begged them to reconsider, saying I was doing this to punish her, saying I would ruin her baby's future. The chair's response was calm and final. This was about policy and documented behavior and trust. Liana's shoulders slumped, and she looked around as if expecting someone to rescue her. But nobody moved. The room had chosen records over tears. When we left the building, Ryan walked past me, close enough for me to smell his cologne, and he spoke in a low voice, telling me this was not over. He did not threaten me directly in a way that would be easy to quote. He simply promised pressure. I did not respond. I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel, hands steady on the steering wheel, and I watched them stand in the parking lot for a moment, two people who had believed in their own invincibility. Then Ryan drove away first, leaving Liana standing alone, and that was the real consequence she never anticipated. She thought the affair gave her power, but the affair was always a ladder for someone else, and ladders get kicked away once you have climbed high enough. My phone buzzed once as I started the engine, and it was Elise, confirming that corporate compliance had acknowledged receipt of the ethics outcome and that our mediation position had strengthened significantly due to documented intimidation and policy findings. I did not feel triumph, but I felt inevitability, the sense that the machine had now locked into a track that could not be reversed by crying or charm. Still, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Ryan could not win through process, he would try to win through chaos, and the final test would be whether Liana chose dignity or sabotage now that her protection had evaporated. The next blow came fast, because Ryan's kind always swings for chaos when records start closing in around them. Liana filed an emergency motion claiming she felt unsafe, hoping the label alone would paint me as the threat. Elise met me at the courthouse corridor, and she told me to let paper speak, not pride. When Liana saw me, she performed fear like it was a religion, but her eyes kept checking for Ryan. The clerk called our case, and the judge asked for specifics, dates, incidents, anything that could be tested. Liana offered feelings and vague scenes, then tried to pivot to the pregnancy like it was a shield. Elise placed our timeline and the intimidation screenshots into the record, then added my written log of the hotel ambush. The judge asked one simple question about time and place, and Liana's answer drifted, because lies never remember clocks. The judge ordered temporary boundaries, mandated paternity testing through proper channels, and warned against false allegations without evidence. Outside the courtroom, Ryan finally showed, not with love, but with control, arriving as if he owned the hallway. He tried to pull Liana aside, but she hesitated because the judge's warning was still fresh in her ears. Elise stepped forward and handed Ryan a stamped notice, confirming corporate compliance had opened a formal action, and that contact through intermediaries was now documented. Ryan's face tightened, and for a second his confidence looked like cheap paint under harsh light. Liana looked between us like she was seeing the real math for the first time. I did not insult her, because insults are gifts to people who need a victim story. I simply told her the same thing my paperwork had been saying for weeks. This ends through records, not through tears. She opened her mouth to bargain, then closed it, because bargaining requires leverage, and she had spent hers on Ryan.